to pass over to you today. I know we're a few minutes early, but I have seen you pop on there already this afternoon. So I'm going to hand over to Matthew now and be back to you all thereafter. Thanks very much.
Oh, there we go. Hello, everyone. How are you? I hope you're all well. So you can see that I'm coming to you from sunny Spain. Not really, but it's just a different type of virtual working. So thank you, Patricia. What I thought I'd do today, basically, is take you through a whole variety of thought-provoking, mind-stretching things. So I'm going to start the presentation. So hopefully you'll be able to see it. I'll share my screen with you. There we go. Okay. So hopefully that's working. That's it. Can everyone see that?
We can't at the moment, Matthew, but Jane's
it's coming up. It's coming up with a who can share, and so it's telling me I can't share my own screen, which is always a fun thing.
It's okay. Jenny's going to come on now and sort that out for you. No problem at all. If you
fine.
can't share it yourself, she can share it for you if you want to. Oh, here we go.
Can you see that now?
We can indeed.
Excellent.
Thanks, Matthew.
Okay, let me just close that. See the wonders I see of virtual events and everything else. I had to go over to Switzerland a little while ago, so it's about 2 or 3 weeks ago that I actually managed to sort of get back on the road. And frankly, it was just odd wearing trousers for an event. But anyway, I will spare you the stories. So as I say, I hope you're all well. My name is Matthew Griffin. I'm the CEO and founder of the 311 Institute and the World Futures Forum. The 311 Institute is a futures and deep futures think tank. So typically what I mean by that is we help a whole variety of different organizations across a whole variety of different sectors see the future. Now, from a corporate perspective, most organizations like to see anywhere between 0 to 20 years out, depending how adventurous they are. But if you're a sovereign government, you prefer looking at the deep future, which is really 20 to 50 years out, particularly when you start having a look at the future of education, jobs, skills, infrastructure, and all these kinds of things. But irrespective of the sectors that I work across and the companies that I work with, the one thing that they all have in common is every single one of their industries is being disrupted from the inside out, and in a whole variety of ways that they wouldn't necessarily have expected before. So just to sort of take you through just a couple of examples of my life as a futurist, if I went back 30 or 40 years ago and managed to have conversations with all of the world's leaders, the educators of the time, and I said that in 2020, I have perfect knowledge and data scientists are in demand, cybersecurity consultants are in demand, and all these kinds of things, they would have asked me, what's that? So, for example, if we have a look at the role of cybersecurity experts, I'd have said, well, cybersecurity experts are people who help protect different systems and things that are connected to this thing called the internet. And I'd have gone, well, what is this thing called the internet? And I'd have said, well, it's changed every corner of culture, industry, and society that we know of. It connects over 3.5 billion people on the planet together. It has transformed the world as we know it. At that point, they, along with other executives, and I'll give you another example, would have shown me something. And you can probably guess what they'd have shown me. If I went back 10 years ago, and I sat with all of the CEOs of the automotive companies like Ford, GM, Audi, Volkswagen, et cetera, and said, I predict that in 2020, you will be making cars that drive themselves, that are electric, and your customers will no longer be your traditional consumers. You'll be selling all of these different vehicles as a service, mobility as a service. Again, just like the governments and the leaders of the time back sort of 30, 40 years ago, I would have been shown this, the door. Because frankly, a lot of the things that we are actually doing today, let alone a lot of the things that we're doing that we'll be doing in 10 years time, just sound crazy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you some of that crazy. But a lot of this craziness basically hasn't sort of been lost basically on the Fortune 250. last year, Jamie Dimon hosted something called the Business Roundtable. It's an annual event held over in New York. And out of 250 CEOs for the Fortune 250, 186 signed up to the concept of ending what they call shareholder primacy. Now, what we mean by shareholder primacy is putting shareholders first. So when organizations are thinking about vision, developing new strategies, how they roll out products, how they innovate, all these kinds of things, shareholders and dividends typically come first, and the long view, the long game is typically just kicked into the long grass, a little bit like golf. So we're starting to already see the complete breakdown of shareholder primacy as organizations move from more of a quarterly and annual focus to more of a longer term focus as they try to sort of tackle basically the changes that are ahead of them, but also as they try to really sort of manage to figure out how they maximize a lot of their opportunities of, you know, the things that will be coming through. So today we have ostensibly a world basically where disruption is the new business as usual. You know, let alone basically when we sort of start talking about, you know, the impact of COVID and all these kinds of things. If I stepped you back again to the 1980s and 1990s and I asked you, what do you think you could do with technology next year that you couldn't do this year? You might have a look at something like computing. And you think, well, computers are going to get faster, they're going to get more performant, and that performance is going to be cheaper. Therefore, we might be able to ingest more information, analyze more information, and we could do something with that. You know, life was typically sort of quite linear. You know, there weren't very many options that technology was going to be able to put in front of you. However, if I ask you that same question now, what are you going to do with technology next year that you couldn't do this year? And this is why everything is accelerating. This is why when we have a look at the future, it's increasingly complex, dynamic, confusing. All of a sudden, basically, you're thinking, well, what impact does 5G have on my business? How do I use artificial intelligence? When I have a look at blockchain, for example, in the role of auditing, blockchain is fantastic, basically, when we start having a look at things like asset tracking, real-time auditing, real-time transparency, and all these kinds of things. We have genetic engineering coming through. We have quantum technologies coming through. Quantum technologies like quantum computers are 100 million times faster than traditional computers at particular tasks. They'll be here. The first commercial ones are already here. But if you really want to get your hands on them and start leveraging them in anger, you're really looking at about 2025. That's the near future, let alone the deep future. Then, of course, we have robotics in all forms, artificial intelligence, RPA. And then, of course, sort of just traditional robots, virtual reality, and so on and so forth. So all of a sudden, when I say to you, what can you do next year that you couldn't do this year? You have thousands of new opportunities in front of you. And it's increasingly difficult for you to try to figure out what's a threat, what's an opportunity, how you quantify them, and all those kinds of things. In terms of these technologies, one of the other things that they do, and they will do this basically for your industry, they will do this for every industry, is they will reduce the cost, effort, and speed per transaction, where transaction can be anything from turning a light on to getting water out of a tap to high frequency trading to zero. And if you don't believe me, here are some examples. Because we like examples. We don't just like sort of talking at you. So for example, when we have a look at access to expertise, increasingly, if you want access to expertise, you can gain access to expertise within the click of a couple of buttons. You know, if you step back 10 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, you could never have gained access to expertise with people in Australia, for example. You might not even have known Australia was even there. When it comes to communication, again, picking on Australia, we can now do internet calls, conference calls like the one that we're on now for free. You know, again, long distance calls, even back in the 80s and 90s, basically, you know, you'd have to put your credit card number in and put your mortgage on the line. Drug discovery, you know, a great example, basically in a pandemic year. It used to cost $3 billion to develop a vaccine, and it used to take 10 years. So effort was the 10 years. Now, it typically is taking around $200 to $300 million, and in some cases a lot less than that, and a year. When we have a look at things like light, you know, again, if you step back, say 50 years ago, 100 years ago, you used to have to light a gas lamp. that was expensive. Nowadays, light, you flick it on at the switch. But as we start reducing the amount of effort that it takes for you to turn light on or to get light into your room, increasingly using behavioral computing, you can walk into your smart home and say, lights on. So even the effort that you expend today of flicking the switch is huge compared to what's already coming down the line. Mobility, photography, just think about the cost of taking photos now. It's zero. So hacking, we'll have a little bit of a look at robo-hackers. The cost of hacking something like the Pentagon is plummeting. The cost of hacking one of your customers' systems is plummeting. Health diagnostics, information access. You want access to information, Google it. So when I say basically that the cost, effort, and speed per transaction of a whole variety of different things, whether it's access to expertise, advice, so on and so forth, is plummeting. So think about this in terms of your own business. Are there any things today that cost you a lot of money, that are effort intensive or slow to do today? If there are, then those are going to start dropping to zero. And if they drop to zero, what does that mean for your practice, your business, your industry, and so on and so forth? And just to prove that things do get cheaper, let's have a look at digital cameras. The first digital camera came out in 1976. It was a cost of around $7 million per megapixel. Today, the cost per megapixel is $0.041, and that was last year, so it's even less now. The cost of digital photography, the cost performance, cost per megapixel, is now 1.7 billion times cheaper. Not alone, storage, and we can apply this to everything. The cost per gigabyte, basically in 1956, it used to cost 820 million per gig of storage. Now it's basically free. We've had a 15 billion fold drop in the cost of storage. And increasingly, you can apply this to things like manufacturing buildings, assets. Think about asset depreciation, for example, basically over time. We'll sort of get into that in a little bit. When we also start talking about how quick we can start disrupting your individual business or industry, it took 75 years for 50 million people to adopt the telephone. It took 50 million people 19 days to adopt Pokemon Go. It took 6 days for 100 million people to adopt Call of Duty. As we all become an increasingly connected and digital planet, at what point, bearing in mind, have a look at this trend line, at what point do you think that I as an entrepreneur can create something that's game-changing, hit the right execution levers, and get 100, 200, 300, 400, 500 million people to download my product or access my service, in which case I change the global landscape in a day. A great example of this is Facebook with Libra, which was their cryptocurrency. They released Libra. Had the regulators not killed it, Libra as a new currency would have been able to be accessed by 2.2 billion people in their own virtual country within a day. In fact, Libra freaked out basically most of the governments so much that the Bank of England, the People's Bank of China, and the Federal Reserve over in the US, it caught them by shock. And they ended up trying to backpedal and figure out what was this thing. It was seen as such a threat to the sovereign fiat currencies that they killed it. Yeah, we are living in disruptive times, but these disruptive times are getting faster and they're getting closer to your door. However, just as before, I sort of talked about the advent of 8 new technologies, exponential technologies. There aren't just 8. I track over 450 exponential technologies. And when you combine all these different technologies together, that's your new product. That's your new service. So I won't go through all of these, but you can download these from the site. So if you go to 311institute.com/explore, you can get access to all of this. But when you have a look at advanced manufacturing, for example, if you are responsible for trying to find new ways for your customers to reduce their costs, just 3D printing in the world of retail helps retailers completely eliminate all of their inventory. It also helps them eliminate their entire global supply chain. One technology, one global impact, one massive $10 trillion disruption in the making. We have bioreactors. I'll show you a little bit of that, just as a little bit of science fiction made science fact. But when we have a look at things like biotech, I'll go through those in a little bit. When we have a look at compute, we have increasingly, we have DNA computers starting to come through. So we start talking about quantum computers that are 100 million times faster and more powerful than today's computing platforms, you know, and that's relevant when you start thinking about the amount of data that they can absorb and crunch and the different type of optimization programs and patterns basically that they can find in the data. We have 5G coming through. When we have a look at 5G, one of the things that I'll show you, his name is Will. All of a sudden, the way that you are able to interact with your customers at scale, 5G changes the game, particularly when we start having a look at the combination of things like artificial intelligence computer chips on phones. So we talk combinations here. And then, of course, basically when we have a look at the intelligence equation down on the right-hand side, we have artificial intelligence. In 2035, we had artificial general intelligence coming through, basically, which is a societal game changer. There's lots and lots going on, but I'll progress now. So one of the things basically that keeps coming up when I talk to industries basically is this concept of automation. You know, what is the purpose of the human in an increasingly AI automated driven world? So for example, basically as more and more organizations start embracing back office automation first and then increasingly front office automation, my feeling is that increasingly it's the human element that is the differentiator. And here we have a lot of people around the world who are sort of attracted by the idea that in order to compete with machines and robots and artificial intelligence, automatons and everything else, they need to become more like those things, those automatons. You don't. You should actually try to be more human. Yeah, and that's where we talk about empathy, creativity, compassion, collaboration, all these kinds of different things. So increasingly, it's that human factor, the human touch, basically, that is more important as we go into the future, not less important. However, when we do start having a look at the automation side of the coin, China in 2018 created the first artificial intelligence foreign policy advisor. So increasingly, when you are starting to negotiate or have conversations, whether it's regarding mergers and acquisitions or whatever it happens to be with particular counterparts, it's increasingly likely that they will be being advised by an artificial intelligence. So this particular AI is actually used by the Chinese government to help them get better trade deals. And that's a real thing. But we also have Will. So I mentioned Will. You can now push this to your smartphone.
Hi, I'm Will. I work at Vector helping young people learn about renewable energy. Here's what happened when I met some students for the first time. I can help you become an energy expert. What should we start with?
Geothermal genius.
Magma from the Earth's core comes close to the surface and we end up with volcanoes, hot springs and geysers. But do you know what magma is?
Molten rock from the outer core.
Absolutely right.
I thought Will was really fantastic.
Like he's there looking at us. Like he's like a real human.
Here's a quick question for you. What do you think is the windiest city in the world?
Wellington.
Nice. If the sun is so far away, how long do you think it takes sunlight to reach us?
10 minutes.
Correct. You're a solar superstar. I was curious if they liked me.
It's different from like talking to Will than talking to like Siri, for example, because like he's there, you can see him.
He was quite human-like, even though he's an AI.
Then the human version of me arrived.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was cool. We got some really good reactions out of a few kids. Yeah.
That's really cool.
A couple of them didn't recognize me straight away. You know it's me, eh?
Oh yeah. True, I can see that.
It's a bit of a shock seeing my digital avatar for the first time. It's like looking in the mirror, I guess.
Let's face it, he may look like me, but I'm the one who knows about energy.
Yeah, I think Will could be used as an education tool in many areas.
We did learn some things that we didn't know.
Wellington is the windiest city. I learned that you wouldn't notice if the sun went away for 10 minutes.
It's not just a blank screen they're staring at, answering questions, so they feel like they're actually interacting with a human.
Human teacher.
It was great meeting the thinkers of tomorrow, because together we can shape our energy future.
So what I showed you there basically was a avatar, a digital human. These are now being produced by a whole variety of companies. You might have seen Neon from Samsung and so on and so forth. What makes Will unique is that he's not a bot with pre-programmed answers. He is a neural network avatar, which means that you can talk to him, and increasingly as artificial intelligence and conversational artificial intelligence starts coming through, you'll be able to have conversations with him just as we could have if I wasn't on this call. So this then takes us into an interesting area. So Will basically and a couple of his colleagues are already selling mortgages via NatWest. They're being used by Royal Bank of Scotland. They're doing customer service for Daimler Chrysler and everything else. So on the one hand, characters like Will could be a new concierge type customer service interface or customer interface. But alternatively as well, your ability to create an avatar like Will is getting cheaper. So we have 5 Fortune 100 CEOs who've actually digitized themselves. Bearing in mind there's a lot of information around us that we put out there onto the internet that we can use to train these different systems. And in their case, basically they are trying to create an immortal version of themselves so that when they die, the idea is that the boards can just phone them up and say, John, yeah, we're doing a piece of M&A basically with company A, just want to get your thoughts on that. And John can come back going, well, in my experience, in my day, I didn't like them because of A, B, C, and so on and so forth. So in addition to that, though, you could create your own avatar. And if it was programmed and contained your experience and your knowledge, you could sell Will as a service. So there could be 1 million Wills advising 1 million customers or 1 million people on 1 million different things. Yeah, that is an opportunity. So it's a threat, automation, it's an opportunity because it's a new income stream. And then of course we have characters like this. So, and this has its own implications.
Hey guys.
Are you Elon Musk?
Yes.
So this is Elon Musk Zoom bombing.
The wrong conference in Zoom. How are you doing, guys?
Good. How are you?
I'm nice.
This is amazing.
Nice hair color, by the way.
Thank you.
It's Elon.
Well, then have a nice day. Bye.
Bye. Have a nice day.
So what we have there basically is we have Elon Musk Zoom bombing a conference call, except as you'll be able to tell, basically it's not the real Elon Musk, it's a deep fake. Now in 2 to 3 years time, you won't be able to tell the difference between a deep fake and a real human. Now, again, on the one hand, that gives you some opportunities basically around service creation. For example, companies like Udacity are actually already using deepfake technology, as well as Reuters are using this type of deepfake technology to create essentially their equivalent of digital humans to deliver new products and services. In Reuters' case, they have a deepfake newscaster that is on 24/7, 365. In Udacity's case, they are taking lecture notes and they are then creating videos around those lecture notes, and it's costing them next to nothing. WPP, the advertising brand, basically doing the same. So if you step back 5 years ago, the cost of creating a deep fake, you'd have had to have a team of about 5 of the world's top neural network and artificial intelligence experts, paying them about $1.5 million each. Now you can create this stuff for free. The cost of this stuff is driving to zero. The amount of effort that it takes to create these types of things is driving to zero. Are you ready? What does this mean for your particular industry, good and bad? So now basically we sort of start looking at it from this perspective. In Fakes and Scams We Trust, when we start having a look at cyber, on the one hand, think about the amount of information that you and your companies consume on a daily basis. We have companies like OpenAI, which landed $1 billion from Microsoft and have ostensibly what they call the world's most dangerous artificial intelligence, GPT-3, which is able to create its own content. In this case, you write a couple of words and it can write you a book. Or a poem, or a report, or a news article, or whatever it happens to be. It can summarize huge volumes of information. If you think about the amount of information that your own industry is actually creating, it can take all of that information and condense it basically into something along the lines of a single chapter so that you can catch up with all of the latest, for example, information on compliance. Would that be useful? That's here today. In addition to that, basically, if you wanted to create some of these particular fakes yourself and you don't have any artificial intelligence experts or experience on your bench, then this is from Stanford. You can just simply type what you want to create, what video you want to create. These are basic, but in the next year, 2, 3 years, these images get higher resolution, they get bigger, they get more detailed, they get more complex, and so on and so forth. This is the world that we call synthetic media or synthetic content. And our ability to use these for useful purposes, like condensing lots of new research or compliance information down into something that we as humans can digest very quickly, very useful. But for nefarious purposes, on the cyber back end, a little bit more naughty. So increasingly, if you think about something like Will, or even the deepfake Elon Musk, as you're looking at me through this web camera, you can analyze my behaviors. Now, there are now neural networks out there that infect your machine and only your machine. And when they see your face via a webcam, they trigger. They are unique to you. These neural networks can increasingly take your biometric cues and start using something called effective computing to tailor their content appropriately to you. So we have the mass personalization of malware and cyber scams and all kinds of nefarious things. So increasingly, when we have a look at cyber scams, at the moment, they are just relatively generic and broad-baked. They're becoming increasingly personalized, very personalized, and they can react to you in real time just to pull any lever that they can find. Now, when we have a look at identity fraud, it's getting increasingly easy to use these same tools, these same techniques to clone you. So, little quiz. What do these two numbers have in common? 1 minute and £250,000. Well, for the CFO of a UK FTSE 100 energy company, it's rather upsetting. So in this particular case, a group of cyber criminals took 1 minute of his boss's, it was a group company, of his boss's voice. And you can do that via YouTube, anything like that, any public speaking event. Take 1 minute of a person's voice, and you can make a very, very convincing copy. What they then did is they duplicated his boss's voice. His boss was the CEO based over in Germany. And the CEO over in Germany phoned him up and said, I would like you to transfer £257,000 into this rather random looking Romanian bank account. And you can look at this on the Wall Street Journal. This is a real thing. They were a little bit suspicious at first, but again, the CEO called back a little bit later and said, look, I noticed that you haven't transferred this money. Very upset about that. Can you get that done now? It's very important. Transfer went ahead. So what would happen to your company's cybersecurity policies, posture, when I can clone not just your boss's voice, but your boss's identity right down to their face and turn that into a deep fake? So this was a phone call. I can increasingly do the same thing and turn that phone call into a convincing video call where your boss is now on a video chat like this saying, why haven't you done that? And then reacting to you in real time. So identity fraud is going to the next level. And the scalability of this stuff is internet scale. The speed of producing it is very, very quick. We're getting close to real time. This is scam 301. When we start talking about ethereal hackers, increasingly we have what we call artificial intelligence robo-hackers. This changes everything about cyber. It's revolutionary and it's game-changing. These types of technologies are used by the US Pentagon already, but artificial intelligence hackers are really human hackers in AI form, but they're able to hack systems hundreds of millions of times faster than human hackers. They look for something called a proof of vulnerability. They can scan millions, tens of millions of lines of code, basically on your front or back office systems for the minutest vulnerabilities. And then they can either, in the Pentagon's case, patch them, or they can exploit them. These are now already breaking out into the wild. And some of these are now autonomous bots, basically within the internet. One autonomous bot recently went around the internet, like an internet policeman, hunting out other bad, nefarious malware bots that infected a particular type of Wi-Fi router and got rid of it. So a kind of good Samaritan piece of malware roaming the internet. It's not long before we'll start seeing these things weaponized, and that's already starting to come through. So just on that one piece, when we have a look at the rate of change basically within the synthetic media and synthetic content space, how it can be used for good, how it can be used for bad, how it can be used to disrupt you, how it can be used for an opportunity. Increasingly, at the moment, the only people who can keep up with any of these changes is we humans. That'll change in about 10 years' time, but given the pace and the depth of change, we are still the best sort of entities in the universe to try and get our heads around all of these different factors. Now, I mentioned we'd have a little look at some of the things that are impossible. These are two designer twins, basically out of China. They were genetically engineered to be resistant to quite a good number of diseases like meningitis, bronchitis, HIV, and those kinds of things. So in vivo gene editing basically is already here. Agriculture. So what I want to try to do here is demonstrate that the things that you think of as science fiction are actually science fact, and we've got a little bit of time. So on this call, what we're going to do is we are going to solve global famine. So I chose this one because it's one of my favorite ones. Meet Ian the chicken. So when you're eating your food later, this disrupts agriculture, but it also disrupts lots of other things as well.
We've all been there, right? In the grocery store. Oh, I'll just buy this meat. And there it is. And all we have to do is buy it. We don't have to think about what it took to make that chicken in that nice packaging. But the reality of the way that it came about, it's incredibly unsustainable. And that's one of the biggest problems facing humanity right now. But we figured out a way to solve it. The whole idea is that that chicken in itself has an unlimited source of itself, and there is a way where you can take just a handful of cells and keep growing them essentially infinitely. For those very first cells, it was important to us how we got the cells, not just that we got the cells. We came up with the idea to use one feather from the single best chicken that we could find. Take that.
First thing we need to do is we need to identify a cell that we're going to use as the basic starter material. And then what we need to do is find a food for it to grow in. So we have to identify the right set of nutrients that will cause the cells to multiply, but not just multiply, but do so quickly and into high densities.
it was an out of body experience to sit there and eat a chicken, but have the chicken that you're eating running around in front of you. You don't imagine doing something like that.
So a little bit earlier, Deirdre talked about sustainability reporting. That one technology there, which is something called a bioreactor, on the one hand eliminates, for example, McDonald's or KFC or a restaurant chain's entire global food supply chain. KFC are now using that technology as part of their future food initiatives. But in addition to that, basically, if you were representing a company like KFC, over 20% of all greenhouse gases actually come from agriculture today. That eliminates it. And as we start talking about the sustainability, today we have a way to remove 70% of greenhouse gases from global emissions right now with today's commercially available technologies. So in that particular clip, what we did is we solved global famine. We improved a particular customer's sustainability credentials, maybe got them a little bit of a tax break as well, who knows, and we disrupted the agricultural industry. So it's not bad for a 2-minute video. In the construction world, when we start talking about things like assets, so particularly COVID, which is a lot of different organizations look at getting rid of their fixed assets, mainly facilities, for example, and buildings and all that kind of stuff. The way that we make buildings is changing, which when we start having a look at things like asset depreciation, these types of technologies fundamentally change how you may depreciate some of these assets. So for example, we can now 3D print buildings. What you'll see here is an entire community that was 3D printed in 24 hours in Mexico. Each building cost $3,000 to produce. And then coming 2021, we're going to be looking at 3D printing skyscrapers. And that went ahead last year. So if you represent a company or a customer basically who is asset heavy or who holds a huge amount of inventory, like retailers, for example, these manufacturing technologies change everything. But I did actually mention basically about 3D printing houses with nuclear reactors. So just to lift the lid on that one, because again, that sounds a little bit impossible. Here is the US Department of Energy. Not that you'd necessarily want a 3D printed nuclear reactor powering your skyscraper. After all, we can 3D print photovoltaic materials basically to do that. But this is from the US Department of Energy, who 3D printed a live working miniature nuclear reactor complete with nuclear core in a lab in the US. So when we start having a look, again, trying to open your thinking, what happens when all of these different technologies come together to disrupt basically how you report, how your business sort of creates or turns itself into a sustainable business? What happens basically when assets no longer necessarily hold the value that they used to, or their value is simply released in a different way? And then when we have a look at retirement at 100 basically becomes increasingly possible. By 2030, increasingly more and more companies around the world, particularly biotech companies, don't just talk about curing disease, they talk about curing death. And there are a whole bunch of them, including Google. The vast majority of leading biotech companies believe that we will reach something called escape velocity on the human lifespan by 2030, around 2029, 2030. What we mean by that basically is that we will have the technologies to extend your life by more than a year for every year that you live. And just giving you a sort of little bit of a glimpse into those, again, yeah, if you recall, I mentioned the cost of different services falls in time to zero. So what if I can use artificial intelligence and the camera in my phone, and I look like I'm taking a selfie, but I'm actually checking myself for pancreatic cancer. I can use the accelerometer in the phone and artificial intelligence to check whether or not I have heart disease. I can check my skin for skin cancer. I can use the microphone and artificial intelligence in this little device here to tell whether I have PTSD, ADHD, the onset of dementia, Alzheimer's, and so on and so forth. It can also tell me whether or not I'm actually going to be ill in 2 weeks' time, because when you get the flu, even coronavirus, we have these technologies being used to detect coronavirus over in the US. When you get coronavirus or when you get the flu, your voice changes slightly. AI and artificial intelligence in the cloud can pick up those minute changes in your voice. And because they've been trained on specific data sets, they can analyze your propensity to a particular condition, or they can tell you whether you actually have that particular condition. So I just democratized access to primary and secondary healthcare in a phone and gave myself a healthcare checkout in the space of about a minute. This is increasingly a tricorder. 3D printing organs, basically when we have a look at our ability to 3D print parts of the human body on demand. So that's where we take some of your skin cells and then we can print you a new liver, a new heart, new brain tissue, new skin, new spinal cords, all kinds of things at the minute, new corneas, new bone. We can now replace 70% of the human body. Again, in about another 10 years' time, but when these are all commercialized, life extension really starts ratcheting up. In vivo gene editing, we have tools and technologies, gene editing technologies like CRISPR and Cas. You put them into an intravenous drip, you take a patient who has an inherited genetic syndrome in a bed, you put them on that drip for about half an hour, they get up, have a cup of tea, go home. Thanks to these new tools can clip out the faulty genes, clip in new genes. They no longer have the inherited syndrome. So we've done that with Hunter's syndrome. And Hunter's syndrome basically is relatively unique because the only good news with Hunter's syndrome is that you'll die in 20 years. The bad news is you'll die painfully. So these types of gene editing technologies now open the door to curing 6,000 different incurable genetically inherited diseases. And they're science fiction like. We have over in the US and China, as well as the UK, we have scientists who've created nanobots that can go into your bloodstream, nanobots, nanomachines, similar things, and drill into cancer cells to kill cancers. So that's been proven. Science fiction becomes science fact. We have robo-surgeons. We have a robo-surgeon in China that recently autonomously implanted 2 teeth into a very brave lady patient. And it did so better than the human dentists. If we combine 5G basically with a robo-surgeon, you can have a surgeon sitting somewhere, say for example in Cork or in Dublin, and they could be operating on a patient in Singapore. And actually, we've been doing that throughout COVID. So when you start thinking about working from home or working from anywhere, we've actually got surgeons throughout London with St. Bart's and St. Tommy's hospitals who've actually been conducting surgeries while they've been at home. So if you don't think that work from home is you, or it's impractical, or you can't do it, think again. We have the technologies already. And then when we start having a look at designer humans, we've got biological supercomputers coming through now, where in China, they're on their 5th version of biological supercomputer, where they turn bacteria into computing and storage devices. We also have scientists who've managed to turn human liver cells and human cells into dual core computers running 2 genomes at the same time. And we've been able to prove that we can turn a human into a disease-fighting DNA supercomputer. So again, the reason why I'm sort of explaining some of these is, on the one hand, to truly demonstrate that we already live in this thing called the remarkable future. But there are so many opportunities out there for your organizations basically to change the narrative that it'd be remiss of me to say, yeah, you should already be doing it. Yeah, if you aren't already exploring some of these technologies, and I know that other speakers are going to be talking about the advent of blockchain. We've had conversations about artificial intelligence. We've also had conversations about being able to analyze how AIs come to their decisions. So that's a field called explainable artificial intelligence, where companies like MIT, University of Columbia, et cetera, are increasingly getting to the point where we can determine precisely why a particular algorithm came up with the answer that it did. When we have a look at sustainability, as I mentioned, we have a path basically to reducing global greenhouse emissions today by 70%, whether it's the electrification basically of transportation, whether it is through the use of things like green concrete, whether it is by using new agricultural and food production methods and all sorts of things. And so the only question then becomes this: what are you going to do with it all? So hopefully you enjoyed the presentation, a little bit of a jaunt through the present day and the future, and I look forward to hearing from you all soon. Take care.
Matthew, thank you so much for that presentation. I don't think I'm overstating the fact when I say mind is completely and utterly blown. The opportunities out there are phenomenal. One question for you, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
You talk about, obviously the remarkable future that's here and all the exponential technologies that are, ahead of us, and the rate of change. At what point are we running out of the time of the change happening sort of, on a line? I mean, at some point it's all just going to blow up, one would imagine. Is it going to stop at some point?
No. So I'll use computing as a prime example of what I mean by the word no. So for example, if you have a look at the laptops that you're using, the smartphones that you might be watching, this presentation on, they all use silicon chips. The next generation of computing basically is neuromorphic, where we have computer chips that are able to ingest and analyze information like the human brain does. So they're self-learning computers. We have quantum computers that are 100 million times faster than the things we're using today. But even beyond those, even though a quantum computer bends the law of Einstein physics, basically, and quantum mechanics, we have biological computers coming through, liquid computers coming through, DNA computers coming through, chemical computers coming through, computers that operate on light. So when you have a look at all of these different strands, everything's accelerating. And even when we think that we can't grind anything more out of an individual technology, like computing, which is just ubiquitous, there is so much more coming along. If you have a look at things like deepfakes, in 2 to 3 years' time, you are not going to be able to discern a deepfake from a real person. That's the general expert consensus on that. But increasingly, when those deepfakes are combined with digital camera feeds, they will be able to react to you. So say, for example, you're trying to sell me something. Yeah, these camera systems will be able to detect flushes in my skin that I'm a little bit uncomfortable. I'm thinking about saying no to you. So then the deep fake starts sweetening the deal, changing the terms, whatever it happens to be. When we have a look at artificial intelligence, we have data scientists who are creating artificial intelligence models today. We have AIs from Google, OpenAI, and Microsoft who are creating their own child AIs. We have AIs from Facebook, Google, OpenAI, Microsoft again, that are spontaneously evolving by themselves. We can kind of think of that as them breaking their programming. So even when we have a look at AIs that are designed by other artificial intelligences, the products that they produced are 30% better at doing what they've been asked to do than the AIs that have been put together by human experts. So in answer to your question, it's a big ball of rolling moss, basically, that just simply keeps rolling into that bottomless pit. and gets faster and faster and bigger and bigger and bigger.
And are we ever going to be obsolete in that case? If they're kind of outdoing us now, at what point are we just going to be along for the ride?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, the general consensus is that by 2035, we have artificial general intelligence. So really 2035 onwards represents a societal seismic shift. If you have a look at the reports into the future of jobs, AI, automation from the White House, so the Obama commissioned a report, also from the European Union. The European Union at the top level came to the conclusion that artificial intelligence and automation will affect every single strata of European society. And at that point, all 28 countries within Europe were strongly recommended to look at universal basic income. However, just because we have the technology today doesn't mean that it's deployed instantly. You know, we have this massive lag. But increasingly, when we have a look at our ability to automate a lot of the lower cognitive skills, so if you have a look at a lot of the tasks basically within the industry and within individual businesses that, you know, mundane administration, we pass those to AIs first. But then increasingly they go up the stack. If we have a look, for example, at Dentons are the world's largest law firm. They are automating the paralegal layer already using something called Ross Intelligence, which is an artificial intelligence. So this is where, from a human perspective, we shouldn't really think about careers for life. We should think of being adaptable, entrepreneurial, inquisitive, curious, all these kinds of things. So today, for example, I'm a data scientist. Tomorrow, I'm something else. And that's a whole conversation that we sort of have with typically G7 and G20 governments about, you know, what happens when individual jobs start dead ending. You know, the answer is always training, but we have a way to see the jobs of the future that are coming through thanks to platforms like edX, Udacity, Coursera, Linda, basically from LinkedIn. So that gives us the opportunity to see what future jobs there are going to be. But as a company, if we know that job A is going to be automated in 5 years' time, we can put a mentor scheme in place to train you on job B. And then when job A is automated, we're ready. We can flip you to job B. But it does increasingly mean that as humans, basically, we have to be adaptable. And the good news is we are adaptable. You know, if you're selling product A today, it's not a difficult ask to get you to sell product B. But that gap requires us to change our thinking and how we treat our staff, internal employee mobility, government incentives around tax incentives to keep, to retain talent as opposed to making people redundant, but also the future education systems as well. And we have the answers. We know how to flip from job A to job B. Then we've got to do it. And at the moment, we're not really doing it. And that's the thing. And that's on us. So we won't be redundant. There will always be things to do. They're just different things.
Well, that fills me with joy because you don't want to get stuck in the same thing
day
after day, year after year.
Variety is the spice of life.
Absolutely. Listen, thank you so much today for joining us. It's been really fascinating insight into our future. And honestly, again, as I say, mind is absolutely blown.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Patricia. Thank you, everybody. And have a great rest of the day. All the best. Bye-bye.
Okay, so now that Matthew has truly opened our minds, I'm going to give you another maths question before I introduce our next speaker. So for those of you listening, it is if 1 equals 4,